when I was studying at Princeton. I was awed by him then, and I'm still awed by him now. And it's a distinct pleasure to be back at Santa Barbara after last year's conference, because as most of you know, a person who I consider a true eminent authority in Islamic law and a very good friend of mine is from your school, and to your great fortune, I heard that he's going to be back. Is that right? Ahmed Ali. Unfortunately, he told me that he wouldn't be able to make it to this conference, and I threatened to cancel. And then relented because I thought it would be too much. But so it's he is well represented by his students in his absence, and I'm sure you're very excited. I should say, I am sorry for being late. Although, you know, increasingly I feel very old. I don't feel like a young man anymore. And I feel very old because I feel that time is speeding forwards. And I'm stubbornly resisting the progress of time. So I'm behind in everything, and late to everything, and increasingly becoming the state of affairs. So my apologies. The issue of, now, reconstituting authority, and I'm not sure that I can shed a comprehensive perspective on the reconstitution of authority for Muslim women in our contemporary age. But I'll share with you some thoughts, observations, if you will, and that I think we need elements, basic premises that we need to think about quite seriously as we discuss the theme of women and power and in our modern age. It is a basic philosophical premise, as well, I think, a theological one. In the case of Islamic theology, when I refer to theology, I'm largely referring to Islamic theology, that the primary relationship that justifies our undertaking or our acceptance of an obligation or the discharging of an obligation, or most importantly, the responsibility and accountability for any obligation and the way or whether it was accepted and discharged, is summed up in the idea of moral agency. Moral agency is debated throughout the Islamic tradition in a variety of ways, variety of schools, but it remained a central theme because its implications are numerous. Its implications not just in terms of discovering what could be a what could be right or wrong, but once we discover what is right or wrong, assuming we do, what type of obligation arises towards that right or wrong? And moral agency is key in this dynamic. And moral agency, not just in terms of the theological or philosophical issue of obligation and accountability, but moral agency, as the sectarian debates in Islamic history often show, and our conception of moral agency, the way we understand moral agency, will also define the nature of the God that we conceptualize. So the way we negotiate moral agency, in fact, also negotiates our conception of divinity and of God, God's self. And those of you who are specialists in Islamic studies will remember all the debates about amorphism and tarsim and sifa and all of that. And it's not debate, they're not just debates out of a thorough historical context. The historical context that is constantly negotiated in various ways is the question of moral agency. Now, one of the remarkable dynamics that has always struck me in the Quranic text is represented well by the verse وَيَسْتَفْتُونَكَ فِي النِّسَاءِ قُلُ اللَّهُ يُفْتِيكُمْ. And they ask you, they solicit responses from you about affairs that involve women. Now here, the author, who Muslims believe is God, is talking to the Prophet Muhammad and telling Prophet Muhammad, I, God, know that they are soliciting you, they're asking you questions regarding various issues and challenges that have come up involving women. And it's quite fascinating because the highlighting of وَيَسْتَفْتُونَكَ فِي النِّسَاءِ, that they ask you especially on this issue, that expression, that idea of the willingness of the divine to respond in the context of an initiated human activity is used infrequently in the Quran and used over very specific issues that time won't allow me to go into. But it is a very particular expression and a very particular dynamic, because while the Quran is divine, and whether you believe, however you see the historical debate about whether the Quran is created or uncreated, what is fascinating in this textual dynamic is that the revelation is withheld, or maybe didn't even exist, unless the moral agent initiated the expression or the demand. And that has profound implications. If you think about it, one wonders, what if the women, and we know from historical sources that nearly every narrative in which this verse is relevant involves, and you can check this yourself, a dispute, a problem, and a woman, always a woman, going to the Prophet, complaining to the Prophet, and then a Quranic revelation falls. And this is fascinating, because what if the woman in question did not take that initiative? What if she didn't engage the Prophet? And in fact, the Quran gives us a hint about this dynamic of a eternal, permanent revelation, but at the same time, a revelation in which God responds in some situations to a direct human agency. The other quite famous part is where men are, and we can get into why I say men, are advised not to be, not to raise certain questions, because if God would answer these questions, men would just invite a greater burden upon themselves. Now, we know from Islamic theology in various discourses and through various ways that there is a constant discourse about the ugliness or the rejection of istikrah, of compulsion or coercion. And this constant theme that if God would have willed, everyone would have believed, and so you cannot force people, and regardless of how the legal system negotiated these textual imperatives, it does not take away from the textual dynamic itself, what is going on in the text of the Quran, because legal systems negotiate things in response to a variety of factors, not just in response to text. But we know that in numerous ways, legal systems themselves respond to their own set of demands and so on. Now, add to this another portion of the Quran, and again, it's a theme repeated in a variety of ways, but I'm sharing with you the expressions that I found most striking and inviting towards rethinking many epistemological questions in our modern age. That when the Quran, for instance, says, وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ جَعَلْنَا مَنْسَكًا هُمْ نَاسِكُوهُ, to every people, however you define these people, we have we have made, or وَجَعَلْنَا could even be read as allowed, permitted, empowered. The all could fit within the word ja'alna, a mansak. And a mansak is fascinating, because a mansak is a method or a habitual practice. This habitual practice could be because of a system of belief. It could be because of habit. it could be because of culture, custom, it could be whatever, but it is a style of life, nearly a story of life. So we often find in poetry the word mansab or nasab is used to describe your or one's method of dealing with life, asceticism, and a refusal to an insistence on your own principled practice is also referred to as nasab. Now, we normally think of verses like this as describing a history, as referring to people, nations of the past. We usually take the usual, if you allow me to use the expression, the usual hermeneutical, biblical style or biblical hermeneutics of looking at past tribes, past nations, but the verse here doesn't fit well, quite unlike other verses that talk about the Israelites or Jesus or the various prophets. Their conduct and their style of life is not referred to as immense. Now, what if this verse is referring to what someone like Mullah Sadra, and before Mullah Sadra, of course, Suhrawardi, or Mullah Sadra describes it in a succinct way as علاقة العاقل بالمعقول. It is in the relationship of the receiver of reality, or the rationalizing agent, the intellectual agent, to the subject of that agency. And Mullah Sadra especially, but we can refers to a variety of other thinkers, that then say, in reality, any conception of husn or qubh, any conception of wrong and good or wrong, must account for the fact that realities are constructed through this dynamic between the perceiver, the subjectivity of the perceiver, and some attributes or characteristics of the perceived, the aql and the maqul. Now, if we take that into mind, then this expression of that every people have been given, have had their particular method or path, we can even read it as an expression of what Muslim jurists or Muslim theologians used to call adat al-khalq, or the nature of creation, what God has, sort of the laws of creation put in place in God. And here, that it's the nature of things, that the path followed by the people, it is something that they would negotiate themselves through that key element of moral agency. Now, we know as well that there are various other expressions in the Quran or proclamations in the Quran, mandates in the Quran that instruct Muslims, human beings, not to cast themselves onto ruin, not to destroy themselves, not to kill themselves. وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَلَا تَلْقُوا بِأَيْدِيكُمْ إِلَى التَّهْلُكَةِ. But we have that fascinating Quranic refrain, الْفِتْنَةُ أَشَدُّ مِنَ الْقَتْلِ, that fitna, in debated among numerous theologians, but the majority of theologians that don't belong to Ahl al-Hadith school have said that fitna is oppression. That oppression is worse than death. And so we find in the thoughts and ideas of Subki, for instance, that in fact the whole Quranic relationship to the idea of nasab, to the idea of a path, is that there are people who, through their own choices, choose a path that destroys them, and people who don't. And that an oppression is a crime more grand than the ultimate death itself. Now we ask the next question, well, what is the nature of the oppression that the Quran is talking about? And I would argue that it is clear that the Quran, when it talks about fitna, it's always paralleled, tagged along with, or made contingent on a very remarkable concept of an istidaf. Those who, well, today we would say the disempowered and the subaltern. A consistent process by which a group of people are rendered disempowered, and because of that disempowerment are oppressed, and because of that oppression they cannot exercise their moral agency, and because of that the whole dynamic of the idea of obligation and accountability for obligation falls apart. And so the whole edifice of the nature of the relationship to God falls apart. In here, in this context, one of the interesting stories that we learned in, I guess what today is called, or nowadays called madrasa, although in Egypt we didn't call it that, is this, one of the sort of stories of wisdom that we hear is, it goes something like this. I know that something is lost in the translation, that a wise man was talking to a student, and the student had fallen into water, into a stream. And so the sheikh asked the student, "Where are you going?" And the student said, "Well, I'm going where the water takes me." And so the sheikh said, "By God, you must have fallen prey to the theology of the Mujabbira, the fatalists. Because if I ask anyone," now all this time this guy is probably drowning in the water as the sheikh is elucidating, it doesn't matter. But the sheikh says, because if I ask anyone, "Where are you going?" and they say, "As anything, as the path that anything might take me," really this person is insane. So the student, now being drifted away by the water, says, "Even if I say I'll go wherever Allah takes me," and the sheikh says, you are insane even if you say, I go wherever Allah takes me. Because, and then of course the question that the teachers would ask, why is this man insane instead of pious? And we all get it wrong, of course, because we were very young. And then after we get it all wrong, the Shaykh would say, because the whole premise of taklif and qabul taklif, the obligation, and qabul and the acceptance of obligation has been rendered null and void. Now imagine here, when I think of this large issue of our epistemological understanding of gender and the role of gender, and it becomes quite troubling, because while I do not believe in historical determinism or historical anachronisms, while I do not believe that we can make these sweeping judgments once and for all from all times till the end, that the perceiver, the relationship of the perceiver and the perceived, certain conditions will result in oppression or the lack of, but it becomes thoroughly problematic if one accepts, as I do, that sociologically there are numerous number of women in the modern day that are in a state of istiqrar, or their agency, their moral agency, has been prevailed over by compulsion, and istidaf, that they are too weak to exercise a moral agency. Furthermore, if we think within the epistemological requirements of a day and age, what does it mean to cast one unto ruin in this day and age? An ill-educated mother, isn't that casting oneself into ruin? A mother that cannot set an example of dignity or inspire a child, isn't that a state of ruin? But leave even all of that. We live in a day and an age in which we don't, the muscles of men serve the role of, muscular men. They fare better in getting Hollywood roles and attracting good-looking women. But they are not necessary, or they do not play the role they used to play in the day where what will make a difference in battle is the strength of the sword. Today it's intelligence and technology and so on. And any nation that somehow dispenses with the intellectual, sheer natural resource of intellectual power of at least 50% of its population by the yardstick of the Quranic discourse itself, I would argue is casting itself unto ruin. There's very little. Now, one will respond as if there were strict textualists here, they'll say, but wait a minute, aren't there this hadith that says this, and this text that says this, and so on? And here, in the context of within each age, the negotiation between the rational and the comprehended, the aql and the ma'qul, must be the epistemology that is the product of their negotiation and renegotiation, must be able to constantly mine the tradition for solutions, and not for formulas, but for inspiration for solutions. So for instance, in one of the reports that is not popularized in our modern age, but which is documented in gazillion Islamic sources, a man from a Bedouin tribe, there was I forget now whether it was the uncle or the wife that complains about the way he treats his daughter. And I'm struck, there was a long interaction, but then the Prophet's comment or reported comment, and whether apocryphal or not, it's completely beside the point, because all these narratives express moral orientations and trajectories in the historical legacy. The Prophet comments ultimately fill up with a man and says, وَمَا أَمْلُكْ إِنْ كَانَ اللَّهُ نَزْعَ مِنْكُمْ الرَّحْمَةِ. What do I do if God has taken away mercy from your heart? Now think about that. The ultimate appeal is to this notion of mercy. If you cannot recognize mercy, then you are an indecent human being. And no amount of law is going to elevate you beyond that. Or another tradition, this one reported in Sunan Abu Dawood, in which the Prophet is reported to have said, whoever lives with a woman, فَلَمْ يَئِدَهَا لم يهنها ولم يؤثر ولده عليها أدخله الله الجنة. This is very interesting. What لم يئدها, I'll come back to that. That's one. Two, I'll come back to number one. But whoever lives with a woman does not ولم يهنها, does not humiliate her, does not insult her. ولم يؤثر ولده عليها, does not prefer the boy over her, i.e. a sister and a son, and doesn't prefer the son over the sister. Or, and you could take this in your epistemological negotiation in a variety of ways, but we know that the idea is that you doesn't give preference to the male whatever. Now let's go back to the first one. لَمْ يَئِدَهَا. Most translators would say, doesn't bury her alive, referring to the historical circumstance of pre-Islamic Arabs burying some girls alive. But if I go back to يَسْتَفْتُونَكَ فِي الْأَمْرِ, this dynamic that God leaves open when it comes to women, that here is a negotiated social context in which there are guiding principles, mercy, justice, and so on, but in which, because we don't have the revelation anymore, we cannot ask God questions anymore, then there has to be an alternative process by which we do the istifta, the presenting of questions to the tradition. And the tradition must be as open and as powerful in its responses as God's self. Now here, if you think وَلَمْ يَئِدَهَا, what if in our contemporary epistemology between the aqid and the ma'qul, ya'id here means to suffocate her, to oppress her to the point that she can't breathe, to make her life a living hell. The terminology clearly would withstand that without any problem. but it is the recognition of that the real obligation, the real taklif, is that if earlier Muslim women were able to go to the Prophet with problems, ask the Prophet, and the Prophet comes back with an open text, an open revelation that seems to be a historically contingent text, a contextual text, a circumstantial text, not a text that, as when it talks about the Israelites and Moses, God is talking about eternal laws that will exist from now till forever and so on. But a text that is responding to specific moral demands. Then the taklif, the obligation here, cannot simply be one of obedience. It must be one of posing the question, making the demand, and generating an epistemology to that demand. Listen, you told me how else to understand various things that you find in Islamic history. Those of you, although I don't see too many Salafi-looking people, but I always pretend that, eventually my tapes will reach them and they're going to have a cow about something or another, which they tend to always have cows. I seem to piss off two categories of equally ignorant people. The Puritan fanatic Muslims and the equally fanatic and equally stupid Islamophobes. So I hear about this, of course. Islamophobes will have a field day with this as well. Don't care. Okay, listen. When we get the text in Islamic history, and it reports to us that Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, in the Battle of the Camel, several of both those who were on her side and those who were opposed to her report to us that she was sending letters to supporters saying the following: من عائشة ابنة أبي بكر أم المؤمنين حبيبة رسول الله إلى ابنها الخالص فلان أو فلان أما بعد فإن أتاك كتابي هذا فأقدم فانصرني. From Aisha, describes herself as the daughter of Abu Bakr, as the love of the Prophet, and then to, which she referred to all Muslim men as her sons, to her son such and such, fulan fulan. There are various names of various people. When you get this letter, come and aid me in my rebellion, the well-known rebellion and the well-known battle of the Camel. Try to fit this woman who is sending, who's not just leading the rebellion, but sending out letters appealing to her authority, her persuasive authority as the mother of the believers, the daughter of Abu Bakr, the love of the Prophet, to people to come and join her cause and support her rebellion. Or if more titillating and less known, within the narratives that fill Islamic history, again, whether apocryphal or not doesn't interest me in the least. Their historical reports, invented, even if invented, they're invented for a reason. You have a personality that is quite fascinating. I'll just tell you her stories. Consider it story time, and and I'll then stop boring you after that. There's a well-known figure, maybe less well-known in our modern age, but still quite well-known. A woman called Aisha bin Talha. Aisha bin Talha was a fascinating character. Her aunt was Aisha herself, the wife of the Prophet. She was the daughter of Ibn Abi Talha, one of the very famous companions. And yet in the narratives of her life, we find several sources referring to a very interesting story of her marriage to her cousin, maternal cousin, who is Abdullah, the grandchild of Abu Bakr, one of the most prominent companions. But yet, the reports tell us that she would have fights with her husband, and she would go stay during that time with Aisha, her aunt. And in one such fight, and I think it looked trivial. I mean, if it was my wife, I'd say that's trivial, but I mean, it meant something to them, very big. She went to Aisha's house and stayed there until her husband, who, don't forget, that's a maternal cousin and someone with some prominence, he's the grandchild of Abu Bakr, until her husband died. And all attempts at reconciliation failed. Now, imagine if we are renegotiating the epistemology of the relationship and our understanding of this obligation, not to ignore the way it was negotiated in the past, but not to be bound by the way it was negotiated in the past, in which you have jurists say all these things about a woman who doesn't obey her husband, the angels will spend the night cursing her and all that stuff. I think it must require us to use our moral being and our intellect when we have someone of the stature of Aisha bin Talha reported, whether it reported to praise or malign her or neither, it doesn't matter, reported to not be this picture of the obedient, oppressed wife. In fact, to storm out of the house and go stay with her aunt until her husband died. She didn't even visit him at his deathbed, which I think is really cruel. That's too far. We have Hussein at the same time, the grandson of the Prophet, the famous Hussein who was killed in Karbala. He was married to the sister of Aisha bin Talha, a woman called Asqaq, a very unusual name, bint Talha. And he commented about her, تظل صارمة فتخاصمني الدهر, that when she gets pissed off, she would show me صارمة, tough, unnegotiable face, and stop talking to me for as long as she wants. He even claimed that he wouldn't find it surprised that if she was pregnant and he upset her, that she would go and give birth to her child and not talk to him. That she would be so stubborn about it that she wouldn't even say, okay, now we have a baby, let's make up, okay, I love you, bright future, and so on. A very different, negotiated sense of moral agency. Consider in our story time the role of, this is shortly after the Prophet died, around the year 50 Hijrah, so 50 years after the migration to Mecca. And we have a fascinating character, a woman by the name of Azza al-Mayla al-Mughanniyah. What does al-Mayla mean to the Arabic student? She's Azza, the singer, but she's in Mayla. Mayla, she has a loose hip, meaning she belly dances. And this Azza Mayla al-Mughniya is the one who goes and fixes two very prominent figures in early Islamic history. I mean, arranges their marriage. She goes, she talks to Mus'ab ibn Zubayr. Mus'ab ibn Zubayr is the son of the famous companion Zubayr, who was allied with Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, in her rebellion. And Aisha bint Abu Talha after her first husband died. And she didn't visit him in his deathbed. So the singer with loose hips goes and she asks Aisha Abu Talha, who is quite, by the way, purported to have been beautiful, but there are so many of these reports that I don't think they're historically reliable as to who's beautiful and who's ugly. Then Mus'ab reportedly is infatuated by Aisha, says, what a great idea, and make a long story short, he marries Aisha bint Talha. But now, in this happy story, consider the following narrative, which you can find buried in several manuscripts. That Mus'ab عاتب مصعب عائشة بنت طلحة على سفورها وحاول أن يردها إلى الحجاب فأجابت إن الله تبارك وتعالى وسمني بميسم الجمال أحببت أن يراه الناس ويعرفوا فضله عليهم فما كنت لأستره والله ما في وصمة يقدر أن يذكرني بها أحد. So, for the translation, Mus'ab notices that his wife is musfira. What's musfira? Uncovered. So he says, cover yourself. Tries to, and does hijab to get her to wear hijab. Look at her response. It's fascinating. Reported response. God, the Almighty, has marked me with the Maysim al-Jamal, with the Maysim is highly praised or highly elevated attributes of beauty. And so I wanted people to see my beauty. And وَيَعْرِفُوا فَضْلَهُ عَلَيْهِمْ. This is remarkable. So that people will know how, by making me beautiful and allowing me to be seen, God has done them a favor. Amazing arrogance. I mean, God, this is, you know, and then goes on, فَمَا كُنْتُ لَأَسْتُرْهُ. I am not going to cover it. You know, وَاللَّهِ مَا فِي وَصْوَةٌ يَقْدِرُ أَنْ يَذْكُرَنِي بِهَا أَحَدٌ. By God, there is no moral defect that anyone that can take against me or can mention against me. And Mus'ab, the day he was killed in battle, was never able to get her to cover. In fact, the narratives go on. I'll just tell you. I know that I should wrap up, but you know, stories are so fun. When Aisha eventually, when her husband is killed in battle, and you know, one of the governors says, well, you know, she's now available as the practice back then. There were, you know, people would constantly marry. So he, Abd al-Malik, from the Amawad family, the son, Bishr bin Marwan, from that family, who could have become a governor or a caliph, I don't, it's possible, approaches Amr bin Ubaydullah al-Taymi. Amr bin Ubaydullah al-Taymi is Aisha bint Talha's cousin. And he says, can you go talk to her so she'll marry me? So Amr bin Ubaydullah al-Taymi goes to Aisha to talk to her to marry Bishr bin Marwan. Now, her response, I think, again, is these things that modern Muslims have completely, with their fascination of everything that comes from anything other than their Islamic tradition, has completely ignored. She responds, أما وجد بشر رسولا إلى ابنة عمك غيرك فأين بك عن نفسك? Didn't Bish find someone else to send to engage me other than you? How about you yourself? What is she saying? She's flirting with him. She's giving him a hint. Aren't you interested? So he, her cousin, سألها عمرو في لهفة أو تفعلين؟ You would do it? You would marry me? So أجابت ضاحكة نعم. Yes. فتزوجت عمرو بن عبيد الله التيمي بدلا من بشر بن مروان. So she married him. Again, the renegotiation of the aqd and the ma'qul and the moral obligation, and those who think Islamic tradition forecloses possibilities, it's because you don't know it. In the same way that you have the most masochistic and ugly reports, you have wrestling with them, fighting with them, reports of a very different orientation and understanding of gender roles. In case this will be my last story. I could sit here and tell you stories for days and days. The key for those of you who are students, take all that's published, and if you find that there are governments behind it, ignore it. And go find manuscripts. Read the unpublished stuff, because there are jewels. It is the huge corpus of unpublished Islamic manuscripts. What a nice song. Now, there is one of the most fascinating figures in early Islam is Sukaina. Sukaina, at one point, had fallen in love with Mus'ab, and their love story is something to be told, but anyway, after her husband dies, she is famous for an incident in which again reported that one of her servants complains she refused to marry after her husband is killed, and refused to marry for a long time. And her servant says, it's really boring in this house. Nothing ever happens in this house. No marriage, no celebration. So she says, you're bored? Yes, I'm bored. Okay, go tell Abdullah, the grandson of Osman ibn Affan, the fourth caliph, the third caliph, that I am interested in his proposal. Apparently she was getting proposals all the time. Abu Zahra, the clan of Osman, of Abdullah ibn the grandson of Osman ibn Affan, is excited about this possible union with the Ali Hashim, and they go and they attend apparently in a respectable group to make the formal proposal and so on. And then Sukaina, as the report goes, that she keeps making absurd demands. Demand after demand after demand. At some point, Abu Zahra starts suspecting that this is not serious. She doesn't intend to marry him. So they start getting angry. Ali Hashim and Abu Zahra have a fight, the sticks. They enter into a fight. And then after the fight, Sukaina simply says, I'm not going to marry. And this feeds the rumor mills in Medina. This is around 67 Hijrah, for about a year, until, and this is the story I want to close with, comes one of the most fascinating, I think, legal cases. Zayd bin Amr bin Osman Zayd bin Amr comes and proposes to her. Now she says, okay, I've been a long time now, I haven't married, but here are my conditions for marriage. لا يمس سواها, you can't touch another woman. One. لا يحول بينها وبين شيء من ماله, he cannot prevent her from spending any of his money. 3. ألا يمنعها مخرجا تريده, he cannot prohibit her from going out anywhere. فإن أخل بأحد هذه الشروط فهي منه خلية. If he violates any of these conditions, the marriage is automatically dissolved. Now, the manuscript tells us, the commentator says, وكان ممكن لها أن تجعل العصمة بيدها ولو فعلت لما خرجت عن عرف المكان، ولكنها خرجت عن عرف المكان بأن جعلت نفسها خلية إن خالف زوجها لها شرطا. That if she would have made the conditions, the violation of the conditions, that then she would have a choice to divorce herself if she so wishes. That was an accepted practice in Medina at the time. But what was her big innovation and fad was that she said, no options, no choice, no discussion. Marriage dissolved. Well, you know, men are notorious for you know, running around and doing things they shouldn't. So Zayd, well, when Zayd accepted her conditions and married her, his family was, especially that Zayd was from a very prominent family himself, and his family were scandalized, and you know, but he said, I love her, so on. Now, so they go on, there are many stories about their life together. But one day he told her, you know, my family is coming to Hajj, and I want to go meet them and do Hajj with them. Please, give me permission for the same idea of this epistemological negotiation. Give me permission. She responds, says, لن أفعل إلا أن يخرج معك أشعر. I will not give you permission unless Ash'ar goes out with you. So then we have to know who Ash'ar is. Ash'ar, it turns out, he is her servant boy, and she tells Ash'ar, you go, and if he comes close to any slave girl, you come and tell me. So her husband Zayd goes out to Hajj and meets Khalifa Sulaiman at the time, and then he knows that Ash'ab is sort of a spy, so he pays him 400 dinars to lie to his wife. And then and says, I cannot take an oath in vain. That would be a huge sin. But I'll give you $400 for you to commit the sin. Ash'ab says, cool, I'm with it. Goes, and indeed Zayd visits a slave girl in a farm that he owned and that he had not seen since he married his wife. Now when they go back, Sakina puts Ash'ab under an intense interrogation. And here again, because I believe it is the language that will be the method of renegotiating epistemology. She first questions Ash'ab. Ash'ab keeps swearing by God, by the Quran, that no, her husband didn't do anything. She's a smart woman though. So she turns to her husband and starts interrogating him. Her husband says, Ya bint Rasulillah, ما سؤال الرسول بنت رسول الله, because she's the daughter of Hussein, the son of Ali, the grandson of the Prophet. فقال يا بنت رسول الله ما سؤالك إياي ولم يزل ثقتك معي وهو أمين علي فسأليه عن خبري يصدقك. Why do you keep harassing me? The man you trust is right here, Ash'ab. Ask him. He'll tell me. So she turns to Ash'ab again. Ash'ab starts swearing by everything holy. At this point, Zayd's conscience wakes up. And now he's swearing by the life of her grandfather, the Prophet. So he says, no, okay, this is too far. So he interjects and he says, والله يا بنت رسول الله لقد كذبك العلج. العلج is Ash'ab. It's like a bad word. Okay, I have to tell you the truth. He lied to you. We're not saying the truth. جزت بالعرج فأقمت هناك يوما وليلة واتصلت بجارية وها أنا ذا تائب إلى الله مما كان مني وقد جعلت توبتي منهن أن أحملهن إليك عشية هذا اليوم فبيعهن. So, okay, he lied to you, we're lying to you, called him a bad name, good measure. But here, okay, I made a mistake, and I did visit the slave girl, and I am here seeking God's forgiveness and yours. And in fact, to prove my goodwill, I will free all my slave girls or servants. I will bring them to you, and you will order them freed. Sakina, of course, looks at her husband and says, لا توبة لك ولا توبة لعبدك الخائن. I don't accept your repentance or your traitorous slave. You know what she does with Ash'ab, the poor, he's not a slave, he's a servant boy. She has him buy, as punishment, straw and eggs. And tells him to put the eggs on the straw and sit on the eggs until they produce chicks. And then says, when the chicks come out, I'm going to call them Banatu Ash'ab. And the poor guy, that name stuck to him, although, of course it never happened, but he became known as Sahib al-Banat. The guy, the father of daughters, and then people say, what Banat? He doesn't have daughters. Say, oh, chicks. But as to her husband, she refused. She said, marriage dissolved, it's end. The story goes on until Umar bin Abdul Aziz comes to power, Abou El Fadl, and her husband finally goes to court and tries to negotiate, because she won't talk to him, renegotiate a settlement. So Sakina comes to court, and she is indignant that she's coming to court. The judge tells her to enter by herself, and she refuses to do so unless she enters with her supporters and her so on. So, and she tells the judge, I don't accept your jurisdiction. This matter has been resolved. I'm not going to even handle this case because there is no judgment for you to render. So the judge says, Ya ibnat al-Husayn, inna Allah yuhibbu al-qasd fi kulli shay. God likes moderation in everything. Means be reasonable. Just listen to us. And she responds, and again, responses and words are important. وَمَا أَنْكَرْتَ مِنِّي إِنِّي وَاللَّهِ وَإِيَّاكَ الَّذِي يَرَى الشَّعْرَ فِي عَيْنِ وَاحِدٍ وَلَا يَرَى الْخَشَبَ فِي عَيْنِ صَاحِبِهِ. Fascinating expression. And what wrong have I done? We are like, your problem is a straw, seeing a straw in someone's eye. My problem is that I see a whole log in someone's eye. Meaning that the moral failure of her husband, the judge thinks it can be negotiated because it's like a straw, like a prick in the eye. But she sees it as a devastating log in his eye. And then it goes on, it reaches a point where her and the judge start cussing each other out, and to the extent that the expert witness who was there and never got to testify says, ما لهذا جئنا يا أبا جهل ولا بهذا أمرنا فانظر القضية ولا تشاكم. We didn't come for this. Abu Jahm was the name of the judge. And this is not what we have been commanded to do. So why don't you deliberate and stop cussing each other out? And then Zayd, the pathetic character that he's become, tries to plead with her to forgive him. And she's response, ما أعرفني بك يا زيد والله لا تراني أبدا أتراك تمكث مع جواريك ثم أعود إليك. I don't know you anymore, Zayd. It's like saying to today's age, the person I married, you're not him. Yeah. I don't know you anymore, Zayd. Do you think, والله لا تراني أبدا, you will never see me again. Do you think you can go sleep with your slave girls and still come back to me? And she storms out of the courtroom, and the marriage, her story continues, but and the judge issues an order, she ignores it and refuses and says that no, it's a settled matter, the conditions, and so on. Now, I go back to the initial point. The easy route is to read a theoretical, socio-political theoretical construct that comes from some intelligent, articulate, eloquent, modern academics who invariably will be from, of course, the West, and to latch onto it and say, okay, that's the goal, that's the discourse, that's where we're going to go. But it does not seep, it does not penetrate very deeply into Muslim culture. In many ways, those who want to renegotiate the moral agency of women have an educational process to perform, an educational process in which their agency and their role as the demanders in that process is not up for negotiation. they demand, and they must insist on just like God was يستفتونك في النساء, that everything is up for renegotiation within the parameters of as the Prophet said, the person who has no common sense or sense of mercy in their heart, no law, no theology will do anything for him, within the parameters such as that if you cannot suppress, suffocate a person within the parameters of the rejection of oppression, istidaf and istiqra, and that al-fitna ashaddu min qatl, that oppression is worse than death itself. I think these are very powerful moral rallying cries if they're only heard and observed. Thank you very much. Any questions? One once?
It seems you've satisfied us all.
If there are no questions, there is a question.
Dr. Abou El Fadl, thank you for coming. Your framework of your epistemological framework of moral agency, and also from some of your works, is the situations of this aesthetic of beauty and looking for the beautiful versus the ugly. And also going back to Abou El Fadl's talk, the situation is a certain kind of subjectivity that allows for a moral agency and a framework of understanding the Sharia, and but how does that not reduce to a certain kind of cultural relativism? Are there certain moral subjectivities or positionalities that can lead one to a judgment that is maybe, or isn't beauty and ugliness culturally and relative?
Well, by beauty, of course, I don't mean the aesthetic. I mean the virtue and the virtue of beauty, and I take it from the Islamic debates on husn and qubh, and I think it's very relevant and pertinent and important that when Muslim forefathers debated the issue of what's right and wrong, they chose the expressions beauty and ugliness, husn and qubh. And as I'm sure you would know, that there are numerous debates throughout Islamic history about to what extent these virtues or goodness can be objective and to what extent are they subjective, and so on and so forth. What I will say is this, is that I think that subjectivity, to the extent that a superficial understanding of moral relativism would accept, is inevitable, meaning that the seeking an objectivism increasingly if it's throughout history, and I would even argue that the Quranic text itself identifying that seeking an objectivism that would remove moral responsibility, that would make a moral inquiry and the investigation behind or after moral determinants is an illusion. The only way to do it is, as philosophers from the culmination of which is Mullah Sadra says, that ultimately haqiqatu juz'iyya, that truth is not so much relative, but in parts, partial. You know, the old Platonic story that Shafi'i uses in his Risala, about people looking at the elephant and each one seeing just a little part of the elephant and so on. And Allah goes beyond that in saying that, in fact, the aqil, the rational agent, constructs the perceived. And I would argue that there is no escape from that, and we should not seek an escape from that. Because when we do, we replace an objectivism that is morally lazy and conducive to an atrophy of the conscience and mind. Now, does this mean I don't believe in any haqiqah, truth in itself? Well, obviously not. I mean, God to me is a haqiqah. It's an ultimate truth. Maybe perceptions of God can differ, but God's self. And the very inquiry, the very process itself presumes that as partial as our understanding of beauty is, husn is, but ultimately there is something that differentiates what is good from what is not good. What are these things that differentiate between the two? That's a big question. But I mean, I'll give you some hints. I take my methodological guidance in defining what is an objectively good is the preservation of moral agency, because it preserves the logic of creation and the logic of our relationship with God. The more we take away moral agency, then the very paradigm of a God creating, testing, punishing, or rewarding falls apart. And that is, and overzealous claims of objectivism end up exactly doing this to the whole notion of religion, and that's why religion itself starts looking dumb and uninspiring. I'll just go.
Right. So when you were reading the Arabic and you were acting it out, it reminded me a lot like the Egyptian TV drama when I was living in Egypt. And I was thinking, have you thought about maybe because a lot of kids nowadays, they don't really read and they tend to become more salafi as a result because of their lack of understanding. And so for you to make it more commercially accessible to them and to do sort of a drama series in English of these stories, I think it's
I just told you I feel old and decrepit and I still refuse to use email. I still refuse to use Twitter, Facebook, and all that weird stuff that people do. My son just got me to carry a cell phone, so that is much wild. I'll tell you what I would be willing to do is that there must be smart young people that I would be very much willing to take under my fold and teach them how to mine this stuff. But I think Muslims have to understand that no one is going to do the job for them. If they don't do it themselves, and that's a serious problem. I can blame colonialism and so on, but it seems to have become entrenched in our culture. The notion of moral agency is not as active and energetic as it ought to be. But thank you for the idea. It's very intriguing. I could have been a movie star. I've missed my calling.
How do you think we should, or at least try to begin to reconcile the rift between what is being said in academia and in scholarship and trying to get that message to the layman outside? Like, for example, with the Arab Spring now, and particularly in Egypt, with the Islamist regime, repeatedly saying we need to tabba al-Sharia, to enforce the Sharia, and they talk to the masses as if Sharia is just one clear book that's static. And when we all know that this is a very fluid, entity, that what they're saying doesn't really make sense. Yet, obviously, because they speak on behalf of religion, they're attracting the masses to this concept. And I'm finding it very difficult to hear this being uttered all the time and for people to believe it, and yet be confined into, rooms discussing it intellectually and not knowing how to get it out to the people.
I mean, maybe is a bit of the skepticism. I mean, the pessimism that comes from just. But I mean, yes, they speak using religion. Yes, they cite sources and so on and so forth. But so do I. So does Ali Jum'ah, the Mufti of Egypt. So does Ahmad al-Tayyib, the Sheikh of Azhar. I mean, I think, when in the engagements that we have, they might claim that no one cares what I say, no one listens to me. That's usually a response, but they cannot claim that I don't know the tradition inside out, and in my belief, much better than they do. I don't think we have to think seriously that since colonialism, there was a sort of an implicit, not necessarily explicit, but an implicit acceptance of the idea that modernizing secularism can be achieved by oppression, political prisons, by groups like Al-Ba'ath and Nasser and so on and so forth. And I think, if anything, it showed us that it only exacerbated the problem. We save exterminating people, which is there is no choice but to go through the hard road of discourse. The thing that I find quite problematic among so-called moderate Muslims is their remarkable passivity, or they instead of funding what they believe in, instead of encouraging the creation of the intellectual forces that are needed to balance out this discourse, they run away. Instead of spending money on educational institutions, they'll go to Paris and buy the latest fashion or perfumes or something. And that has left a very a really disastrous situation, because I can name so many intellectuals that offer promising routes, methodological routes, but the one thing that I can say about all of them, without exception, is that unless they were born to a rich family already, they're all suffering in terms of resources. They exist on their own resources. While, of course, as you know, the other side is bankrolled quite handsomely and quite generously. The Islamic civilization itself was created on the willingness of people to create awqaf, foundations that funded. It's not the caliphs that built the roads and the waterworks and all that. It was awqaf that created the infrastructure of the whole Islamic civilization. Call it a night? Good. Okay, thank you so much. Sorry again for keeping you late.
All right, so that concludes our second day of the conference. Thank you again, Dr. Abou El Fadl, for an engaging conversation.